Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Crooked Snake, The Life and Crimes of Albert Lepard, by Lovejoy Boteler, narrated by John Mclain. But these backwaters of existence sometimes breed, in their sluggish depths, strange acuities of emotion. American Fantastic Tales, Edith Wharton. Author's Note. In writing Crooked Snake, telling Albert Lepard's story, I have relied on numerous sources from 70 taped interviews, family members who knew him best, people who were victimized during his 6 escapes from the penitentiary, law enforcement officers who pursued him off and on over 14 years, and ex-convicts who had foolishly followed the charismatic Lepard. I have also included information gleaned from newspaper articles located at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. The narrative of Mary Young's death is woven with official statements made to law enforcement by Lepard and his cousins in 1959. My own random kidnapping is told as I experienced it when I was 18 years old. Scenes throughout the book are taken from the clear and colorful memories of the individuals involved. In the few places where I recreate a scene, I might, for example, use the words "I imagine" or "they must have thought" to precede it. The dialogue is written as spoken. The Cineash Valley runs from east to west and is located in the hills of southern Itala County, the geographic center of Mississippi. It is bounded by the Big Black River flowing across its western end and the Natchez Trace, loosely defining its eastern edge. Cineash Creek winds its way through this valley and is the setting for much of what follows. Chapter 1. Jackson. I don't know how many people were kidnapped in Mississippi in 1968, but I was one of them. I was taken from my family farm that June by 2 escaped convicts from Parchman Penitentiary, John Parker, convicted of armed robbery, and Albert Lepard, sentenced to life for murder. I was sure I would die. Despite the terror of that event, I survived. My life has moved far beyond the bean field where it happened. I finished college, clerked for the legislature, worked on the river, was a rodeo hand in Colorado, had a family, built houses, taught school, and made music and furniture. But I have told this story at least once a year to most anyone who would listen. My wife, who has heard the account 100 times, said I must write it down. But I wasn't so sure. This particular slice of history ought to be told to wide-eyed kids around a fire pit on a moonlit night, or folks getting tipsy at a cocktail party before dusk. Being kidnapped was quite an oddity. In 1963, when I was 13, Frank Sinatra Jr. had been kidnapped for 2 days. I had a vague memory of that news because my parents talked about it around the dinner table. Patty Hearst was taken in 1974 by members of the Symbionese Liberation Army and would not be found for a year and a half. After her ordeal, the world became familiar with Stockholm Syndrome, a condition that causes hostages to develop a psychological alliance with their captors as a survival strategy. They were both 19 at the time of their kidnappings. Images of my abductors had slipped in and out of my thoughts for a long time in mean snippets of memory. Their ominous approach on our field road, the tense encounter, a revolver in my ribs, fear, commotion. Deep in the bottom drawer of an old walnut secretary in the living room was the kidnapped scrapbook my mother had made for me after I was abducted. She had been greatly disquieted by the whole affair. I tunneled under mounds of paper to exhume the musty relic. It contained photographs and news articles from the Jackson Clarion Ledger and the Memphis Commercial Appeal, with a list of the convicts' crimes. Their defiant mugshots stared from the newsprint. Lepard's menacing don't-give-a-damn gaze was etched in my psyche and gave me a jolt. A grainy black-and-white photo of me holding my hands up as a detective examined my fingerprints shot me back to the scene of the crime. I was 18 years old. On the last page of the album was a letter from the penitentiary addressed to my father, a member of the state legislature, thanking him for the part I played in the capture of the convicts. It read, August 5th, 1968. Honorable E.L. Boteler, Riverdale Farms, Route 3, Grenada, Mississippi. Dear Sir, enclosed is application for reward in the case of Albert Lee Lepard and John Parker. Please have your son, Wallace Lovejoy Boteler, sign before a notary public and return to us. Upon receipt, we will forward to the Executive Department with our request for payment. We would like to extend our compliments to your son on the manner in which he handled such a delicate situation. Sincerely, B.C. Ruth, Classification Officer. Parchman sent me a reward of $50, a remarkable sum for a Mississippi farm boy in 1968. I closed my eyes and let the memory of that uncommon time envelop me. The red-haired killer, hot wind through the truck, my brother's rifle, my pistol, their pistol, the long ride. I snapped out of it, focused on the present. I needed to find one more vital artifact, the pair of 1922 piece silver dollars Lepard left me. My mother had carefully glued the coins on a rectangle of red felt and put them in a simple black frame. I rummaged around the house most of the morning, but to no avail. Frustrated and about to abandon the search, I reached up and felt around the top edge of a tall hutch. There they were, hidden away years ago for safekeeping, so secure they were almost lost. The coins were tarnished tokens with a worth to me far beyond their face value. Decades earlier, Lepard held these coins in his hand, and for a strange reason known only to him, left them in the pocket of our farm truck for me to find. I've shown them to a few people, not many. The Clarion Ledger stated that Lepard hailed from Newport, a wild and rugged place in central Mississippi. A coffee-stained road map pinpointed Newport as a mere dot 70 miles northeast of Jackson. I debated the wisdom of going there, but the spark had been struck. Now was the time to unearth the life of this felon from my past. I fervently hoped to find other people who were, like me, his victims, tied up and robbed, abducted, or worse. And I would try to meet his family. The next morning, armed with the 2 silver dollars in my pocket, I hugged my wife, told her not to worry, that I would be home for supper. And as she later said, I just took off. I departed for Newport with little fanfare, leaving the polite society of Jackson, aiming for a remote hamlet in the rough heart of Mississippi, where people most likely wouldn't take kindly to nosy strangers. Chapter 2. Newport. The truck rolled to a stop at the intersection of Highways 14 and 429, far from any major thoroughfare. A green and white sign read, Newport. I was the proverbial stranger in a strange land, an interloper, but a man on a mission. I had arrived at this isolated spot 35 years after being kidnapped, on the trail of my long-ago abductor. There were no passing cars or stores bustling with customers, no strolling window shoppers or children riding bicycles. Just 2 buildings, a church and a restaurant, facing each other across an empty expanse of highway. A languid breeze blew out of the southwest, drawing moisture from a silvery lake. Surrounding the lake, a few rustic homes showed little sign of activity. Across the pasture, where the valley floor rose to meet the hills, a faint summer haze hung over a line of distant oak trees in the afternoon light, suggesting long-held secrets hidden in the forest beyond. Farther to the east, a gravel road forked south from the blacktop, winding into the hills. Partially hidden in a grove of pecan trees, a white frame house stood right off the gravel road. I drove up the ruts, scattering a flock of chickens and 1 rooster. The banty male was roaming the yard, pecking the slick ground and nosing a scattering of paper garbage. I opened the truck door, and the startled rooster chased his harem of hens under a flat-tired green Ford station wagon parked in the side yard. A mangy black dog hiding beneath the half-rotted front steps growled at me. As I neared, he retreated farther under the house, but kept up his low snarl. I walked up the well-worn steps onto the porch and knocked on the flimsy screen door. I heard the whisk of house slippers shuffling forward, too slow to be a young person. The door opened, and an elderly woman with cold dark eyes peeked out. Her face was thin and worn, her hair flecked with gray. She appraised me. "Can I help you?" I hadn't prepared what I wanted to say. Felt awkward. I blurted out the first words that came to mind. I had a run-in with Albert Lepard, but I was young. There was a moment of silence. "Well, bless your heart. Come on in." The acrid smell of day-old turnip greens emanated from a darkened room in the rear of the house. "Johnny," she called, then took my arm and guided me to a threadbare brown couch in the small sitting room. Across the room, I was startled to see a bare-chested man wearing a green John Deere cap, faded jeans, and no shoes. He sat in a straight-backed chair staring at me. I thought he might be your son. He never spoke. "Johnny!" she called again, this time more emphatically. A silver-haired man in khaki pants and a loose white shirt emerged from the dim hall and looked at me with mild wonderment. I shook his hand, introduced myself, briefly told my story, and asked if they might be willing to share what they knew about Albert Lepard. They looked at each other, unsure of what to say. So I showed them the 2 1922 silver dollars Lepard left me. Johnny reached for the coins, closely examining them as if they were ancient relics. "Yes, we knew him," the woman said. She introduced herself as Margie Fay Hutchison. Her sister, Betty Jean, was married to Ray Edwards, Albert Lepard's first cousin. She and Johnny knew all the Lepards. Johnny proceeded to name a few. There was Bilbo, Jarsh, Campbell, and Otis. Them was all brothers that played fiddle and mandolin. Campbell's son Ernest was gut-cutting and knife-fighting throwed in the Kosciuszko jail. He stuffed his intestines back into a foot-long wound and stitched himself up on the floor of the jail somehow or other. Johnny added that after his release from jail, Ernest would probably pull up his shirt and show that huge ugly scar across his abdomen. He was a massive man, and like many Lepards of that generation, Ernest liked to fight. "You know, any normal human being couldn't have survived that," Johnny said, almost reverently. "That was a Lepard for you," Margie added. "Ernest once picked up a 500-pound bale of cotton using only his teeth." I guided the conversation back to Albert Lepard. They told me he had a hideout in the deep woods, a secluded place called Flowing Well, where Margie once took him food when he was on the lam from the law. She admitted her part in helping Lepard. "I took it in one of them pie plates, cornbread, peas, and butter beans, and a glass of tea. I took that food over there, he reached out and got it, and I come to the house. I knew I was doing wrong by feeding him, but I'm not going to let a dog go hungry if I can help it. I might have to go to jail, but I sure fed him. Yeah, he loved iced tea." I sensed there was much more they could tell me about Lepard, but this was all they were willing to reveal. How did she know he was at Flowing Well? People told her, but she wouldn't say who. Johnny suggested I should go down the highway and talk to Bailey Hutchison. He made it clear that despite sharing the same last name, they were not related. "Bailey could tell you a lot," he said, nodding. Margie added another note about Lepard. "I never was scared of him, and honey, if he was to call me today, if he was living and sitting back there somewhere and didn't have food, I'd take it to him. People do have feelings for him," Johnny added. I thanked them for their hospitality, and as I stood to leave, I glanced into the corner of the shady room. The silent, half-dressed man's eyes followed me, all the way out the door. Margie and Johnny Hutchison were my introduction to an eccentric world, one that would consume me for the next few years. But my immediate goal was to find Bailey Hutchison and learn what he knew about the man who had once rammed a pistol in my side. Bailey's property stretched out behind his house, land farmed most of his life, but was now laid by because he was retired. His home was a simple red brick building on the south side of Highway 14, surrounded by a spring pasture of Bermuda grass. In the distance, a line of trees defined where Cineash Creek wound its way through the valley, its small swirling eddies carrying sediment downstream to the Big Black River. The pungent smell of newly mown hay floated in the air. Across the pasture, round bales dotted the landscape like tawny anthills. When I asked him if he had known Albert Lepard, Bailey laughed. "Yeah, I knew him. Come on in." He had been watching a Mississippi State football game and motioned for me to take a seat on a plaid ottoman next to his worn recliner. He reached forward to turn down the sound. I told him about my close encounter with Lepard in 1968 and showed him the 2 tarnished silver dollars. He smiled, took a sip of iced tea. He began to tell me, in his slow drawl, what he remembered about Lepard and his family. Otis Lepard had sharecropped on Bailey's farm. Ruby, Otis's wife, Albert's mother, was Mr. Henry Tullis's daughter. They were pretty poor. Mama used to give 'em clothes all the time, try to help 'em. My mother felt real sorry for 'em, you know. Them kids lived there with their daddy after their mother died. Their daddy was gonna make a crop with me, but somehow or other he didn't. Bailey couldn't immediately name all the children, but said for a short time they lived right yonder, pointing out his rear window toward the hills where a power line now crossed his land. But most of the time, however, Otis and Ruby Lepard lived with their 6 children on the Hemingway place, 2 miles south of Newport. They considered it home and always returned to the place when they weren't living a migrant life. The children he finally remembered were, in order of age from the oldest, Kathleen, Homer, Jessie D., Albert, Marguerite, and Tom Anderson. From the time they were big enough to carry flour sacks, they toiled in the cotton fields with their mother. Otis was considered unreliable because of his insatiable thirst for liquor. He always had trouble establishing a long-term relationship with a landowner and hauled his wife and children along from job to job. In a sharecropping arrangement, the landowner typically would provide advance money to help the sharecropper get started. Occasionally, the landowner had to demand his money back when things didn't pan out. Bailey remembered. For some reason, he turned his mules and plow tools over to a black fella on the place. So I just went down there and told him, "You not gonna work a crop, you got to go, and I want my money back before you go." He gave me my money and moved on. The late afternoon sun dipped toward the ridge as my first visit to Newport came to an end. Margie, Johnny, and Bailey spoke openly about Albert Lepard. Margie admitted she took Albert food when he was desperate and hiding at Flowing Well, a hidden refuge far back in the woods. Johnny momentarily became emotional about Albert's plight, and Bailey gave me a better understanding of the hand-to-mouth existence of Otis Lepard and his family. Over the next few weeks, other residents of the valley came forward, mostly family members. Willie McDaniel, John Henry Lepard, Ray Edwards, and Earlene Lepard told me intimate and often gripping stories about their wayward relative. Albert Lee Lepard was born July 23, 1934, in southern Itala County, Mississippi, in a small valley carved by Cineash Creek. Cineash is based on a Choctaw word, Sinti Asha, loosely meaning crooked snake. Albert's most identifying feature all his life was a shock of red hair, wild and bushy for his small frame. His family was poor and existed in a social stratum slightly above the cows and horses, but lower than everyone else. Wearing their hand-me-down clothes, the Lepards scratched out a living in the bleak years of the Great Depression. Albert's father, Otis, when he wasn't drunk, was known to have an affable personality. He made a feeble effort at sharecropping, but it was Albert's mother, Ruby, who mostly worked the fields with her children. The rough husks of the cotton would leave their hands raw and bloody by day's end. Everyone knew Ruby was slightly off, but she loved her children, especially Albert. Otis and his brothers lived in an alchemy of violence and mountain music. In the loamy sand hills bordering the Cineash Valley, they played the ballads passed down from their great-grandparents in the years after the Civil War, ones that told of heartache and loss so deep that the emotions were still palpable 100 years later. They knew songs from the Great Depression, Going Down That Road Feelin' Bad, and One-Dime Blues, anthems for the dispossessed. They emulated the drunken tunesmith and Alabama heartthrob Hank Williams. Music filtered into the Cineash Valley from the mountains of North Carolina through Alabama. Etta Baker, a grandma who could play a flat-top guitar with a jackknife, Doc Watson, the blind picker and singer of enormous talent, and Earl Scruggs, with his sizzling, innovative five-finger banjo style. The Lepard brothers would rock the valley, carrying on the old musical traditions vital to their souls. Old-timers in the region still tell of their rambunctious house parties. Albert was remembered as a quiet boy with musical talent. He hung around the edge of the festivities, too shy to get up on stage, but idolizing his uncles and the music they made. John Henry Lepard remembered him as bashful. Their uncle, John Alec, once said about Albert and his brothers, Homer and Tommy, "They can sing real good. If they had had an education or something to go with it, they could probably go a little distance in the music world." Ray Edwards added his thoughts. "He could really sing. One of the goodest singers you ever heard in your life. Bluegrass singing." "Yeah, Jarsh and his brother Bilbo played guitar and fiddles," Earlene Lepard said, remembering her husband Jarsh. "They played for the country dances they used to have around in people's houses, and they'd play all night." Albert would hide under the house in a secret place to hear that fiery music. Earlene's vivid description of the house parties prompted me to imagine that rambunctious scene. "Raspberry pie, huckleberry pudding, give it all away to see Sally Gooden." The uncles kicked off their evening session. With every foot-stomping beat, gray dust sifted under the porch where Albert lay in the shadows, enthralled, soaking in every note. Jessie D crawled under and sat beside him, her homely cotton dress blending with the cool dirt. Through a gap in the porch skirt, out in the freshly swept yard, they could see the crowd moving to the music. "I love pie and I love puddin'. Crazy about that gal what they call Sally Gooden." Jessie D seized Albert's wrist and pulled her scrawny younger brother from his hiding place into the evening air. A blood-orange sun burnished the clapboard house in coppery light as a popular A.P. Carter ballad began. "You are my flower that's bloomin' in the mountains so high." From a berry-laden barbed-wire fence, Ruby Lepard beckoned her two middle children. The dusty children ran to her and hid their faces in her gingham skirt, hugging her tightly. With a broad smile, she revealed the warm contents of her apron's big front pocket, a mess of luscious dewberries, so ripe they were already bursting. The children slapped their hands on their sides and reached for the wild fruit. They shoveled the berries into their mouths until the bluish-purple juice dripped down their chins. Jessie D ran off laughing into the crowd of rowdy revelers. A blaze crackled in the gathering dark. Yellow flames licked a blackened pot of stewed squirrel. In the light of the campfire, hooch flowed like water, and earthy laughter floated through the pines into the summer night. Albert's mother placed her cool palm on his face. The two of them slipped into the house, away from the rising temperatures being generated by the boiling kettle and the moonshine. Her husband Otis was getting soused, along with all the others, and she needed to be prepared for whatever might happen later. The extended Lepard family tried to protect the children, offering them safety and solace when Otis was possessed by his devils. Jarsh once decided to check on his sister-in-law Ruby and her children, since he had not seen them in a while. He discovered they had been without food for so long they had to start back on water, then soup. Ruby was convalescing from tuberculosis, and it didn't come as a surprise that once again Otis was sprawled out in a stupor in the back room. Ray Edwards remembered. We went down there, and Uncle Otis would get so drunk on weekends, spend their money, throw their money away for whiskey when he ought to be buying food for the kids. That boy had a hard time. All them young'uns had a hard time. Despite the deprivations the children endured, Willie McDaniel remembered Albert's winning personality. Albert was just a good fella, real good, when he was young. Aunt Erlene agreed. He was always singing. Despite it all, he was always a happy person, and a good person to be around when he was younger. He was a hard worker, a real hard worker. Then he got into that pretty bad trouble. Bailey Hutchison remembered teaching scripture lessons to Albert in Sunday school at Salem Methodist Church, which stood right off Highway 14. In church, the Lepards frequently sat on the back pew as sanctified melodies floated out to the main road. Although Ruby couldn't read, she clutched her Bible, and it gave her comfort. She wanted her children to have a proper religious education. Church lasted into the afternoon, and Ruby, still holding the good book in one hand, held Albert's in the other, as she led his siblings and him down the path toward home. She more than likely felt righteous and protected, and that God had a plan for her children. Albert's attraction to illicit activity began with his peddling of homebrew. Moonshining techniques in Italic County were passed down through some families like Thanksgiving recipes. These traditional recipes were much older than anyone could remember. They originated in the Appalachian Mountains, and in areas of the country where people were strapped for cash, it was a way to get more money for your crop. White lightning is usually made from corn, the least expensive grain. First, it's ground into meal and placed in a tub of water. This soupy mix is called mash. In about 3 days, the mash ferments to produce alcohol. The result of this process is moonshine, a cheap, illegal brew, with a ready market. Lipsy Branch, a former county road grader operator, remembered stumbling upon one of those rot-gut stills. Lipsy said, "I seen a good bit going on, whiskey stills and everything. I stopped and eat dinner one day and was right up on one. Somebody said it was probably Big Boy Williams. I went up there and looked at it. Wasn't nobody there, and I might have got shot if it was. People'd kill you." Some boys deliver newspapers or mow grass for extra money, but young Albert Lepard was a top salesman for the moonshiner Leon Turner. When he was about 10 years old, Lepard rolled tires down Highway 14 in Italic County with pints of Turner's Shine taped to the inside. Customers in the know would pull up to purchase their weekly allotment, and Albert would earn his pocket change. Today was such a day. In the dusky half-light of late afternoon, a car paused, and a man called out. The boy looked at the man, stopped the wobbly tire rolling, and reached inside. Taped to the lining were bottles of bootleg. He stripped off the dirty tape and tossed a crystal liquid-filled bottle underhanded toward the car. The man snatched it from the air and tucked it under his shirt. The smooth customer looked at the ragtag boy holding his hand out, called him over, and palmed him a $5 bill. Albert slid the folding money into his worn pants pocket and watched the Plymouth drive away. Its bright red taillights flashed in the twilight as a doe bolted from the dense woods, crossed the road, and disappeared into a tangle of bramble. Albert sold liquor to earn money for his mama, and it beat working sun-scorched fields in the place of his sadly predictable daddy. When he wasn't selling hooch or toiling in the fields, Albert had his own prankster ways of making fun. When he was about 10...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?